I realized I had already lost everything the moment I saw my name missing from my own husband's funeral program. The morning air was crisp, the kind that settles into your bones and reminds you of every year you've lived, and as I stepped out of the black car in front of St. Matthew's Church, I held my breath longer than I should have, as if delaying the inevitable might somehow change what was waiting for me inside. 42 years of marriage reduced to a single day, a single ceremony, a single moment where I was supposed to say goodbye. But nothing about that morning felt like it belonged to me, not the polished wooden doors, not the quiet whispers of guests dressed in black, not even the sympathy in their eyes as they glanced at me and quickly looked away. I adjusted my coat, smoothing down fabric that suddenly felt too heavy on my shoulders, and walked toward the entrance with slow, measured steps, each one echoing louder than the last in the silence of my own thoughts, because something felt off. Something I couldn't quite name yet but could already feel settling deep in my chest like a stone. Inside, the church was filled with soft organ music and the low murmur of voices, familiar faces from decades of shared history, neighbors, colleagues, distant relatives, all gathered to honor my husband. But as I reached for the program handed to me at the door, my fingers paused for just a moment before taking it, and when I looked down, I felt that stone inside me drop even further. My name wasn't there. Not where it should have been, not beside his as his wife, not even mentioned in the small paragraph summarizing his life, just a blank space where 42 years should have existed, replaced instead by a carefully written tribute that seemed to orbit around someone else entirely. I didn't say anything, I didn't ask questions, I simply folded the paper once, twice, until the edges aligned perfectly, and lifted my gaze to scan the room, searching not for answers, but for confirmation of what I was beginning to understand. Olivia stood near the front, dressed in a perfectly tailored black dress, her posture straight, her expression composed in a way that almost felt rehearsed, as she greeted guests with a soft, controlled smile, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, guiding him, positioning him, shaping the narrative before it even had a chance to be questioned. My son didn't look at me, not when I walked in, not when I moved down the aisle, not even when I passed close enough to touch his sleeve, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he was avoiding me, or if he simply no longer saw me at all. I took a seat in the second row, not the first, even, though I knew that was where I belonged, but the front pew had already been arranged, reserved, filled in a way that made it clear my place had been decided long before I arrived, and again, I said nothing, because silence can be louder than any protest when you're paying attention. The service began, words were spoken, memories shared, stories told about the man I had spent my life beside, yet each story felt distant, incomplete. As if I were listening to someone else's version of him, one carefully curated and filtered through a lens I didn't recognize, and when Olivia stepped forward to speak, her voice steady and clear, I felt the room shift in a way that confirmed everything I had been sensing since I walked through those doors. She spoke about legacy, about family, about the future, but never once did she look at me. Never once did she acknowledge the woman who had built that life with him from nothing. And as the guests nodded and listened, I realized that this wasn't just a funeral, it was a quiet transfer of power, a moment carefully orchestrated to reposition everything I thought I knew about my own life. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, eyes fixed ahead, and for the first time since the morning began, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, because in that moment, as they believed they were rewriting the story without me, I understood something they didn't. Something they hadn't even considered, that while they were focused on appearances, on control, on winning a moment, I had already begun to see the entire game unfolding, and more importantly, I had already decided how it would end. I remained seated long after the final hymn faded into silence, long after the last pair of polished shoes had stepped out of the church and into the bright afternoon light, because leaving felt too simple for what had just happened, and I had never been a woman who walked away without understanding the full shape of a situation. The air inside had grown still, almost heavy, as if even the walls were holding on to what had been said and what had been carefully left unsaid. And I let my fingers rest lightly against the edge of the pew, tracing the worn wood as though it might ground me in something real, something that had not been quietly rewritten without my consent. I replayed every detail in my mind, not with emotion, but with a clarity that surprised even me: the missing name, the subtle shift in seating, the way conversation seemed to pause just a second too long when I approached, and most of all, the way Olivia had positioned herself at the center of everything, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a kind of calm authority. That only comes from preparation. I had seen that kind of control before, not in her, but in business meetings years ago, when my husband would describe negotiations that had already been decided long before anyone sat down at the table, and suddenly the comparison settled into place with an uncomfortable precision. This had not been a spontaneous oversight, it had been planned, layered, and executed with care. I stood slowly, smoothing my coat again out of habit rather than necessity, and made my way toward the front where the remaining flowers were arranged with almost theatrical symmetry, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to look at his photograph, the one chosen for the service, smiling in a way that felt familiar and distant at the same time, and I wondered when exactly that distance had begun to form, not between us, but around me. Footsteps echoed softly behind me, measured, confident. And I did not need to turn to know who it was. Olivia's presence had a way of announcing itself without sound, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same controlled warmth I had heard all morning. "Margaret, I was hoping we could talk for a moment, just the two of us," and I turned slowly, meeting her gaze with a calm I had not known I possessed until that very moment. "Of course," I said, because refusing would have given her something she wanted, and I had already begun to understand that every reaction mattered now. She gestured toward a small side room off the main hall, one I had walked past countless times over the years without ever stepping inside, and as we entered, the quiet shifted from ceremonial to deliberate, the kind of quiet that suggests conversations meant to stay contained. She closed the door gently behind us, not abruptly, just enough to signal that whatever came next had already been considered, and for a second she simply looked at me, as if measuring how much I already knew, how much I was capable of seeing beneath the surface she had so carefully constructed. I did not speak, I did not rush to fill the silence, because silence, I was beginning to realize, had become my greatest advantage. She clasped her hands lightly in front of her, her expression softening just enough to appear sympathetic. "Margaret, I know today has been difficult for everyone, and there are some decisions we need to start thinking about moving forward, practical things, arrangements, responsibilities," and the way she said it, the order of those words, told me everything I needed to know. This was not about grief, it was about transition. About control shifting from one set of hands to another, and in her mind, that transition had already been completed. I nodded slowly, allowing her to continue, because the more she spoke, the more she revealed, not through what she said, but through what she assumed I would accept without question. "Daniel thinks it might be best if we start looking at the house," she continued, her tone careful, almost gentle, as if presenting something that had already been decided as a suggestion. "It is a lot to maintain. And there are options that would be more comfortable for you, communities with support, activities, people your own age," and there it was, laid out with a precision that made my chest tighten just slightly, not from hurt, but from recognition. I had heard this language before, softened, repackaged, but always leading to the same conclusion. I watched her closely, noting the way her eyes flickered for just a moment when I did not respond immediately, the smallest crack in an otherwise seamless presentation, and in that pause, I understood something that changed everything. She was not entirely certain of me, not yet, and that uncertainty was the only space I needed. I let a breath out slowly, lowering my gaze just enough to appear thoughtful, perhaps even uncertain, and when I finally spoke, my voice was quiet, steady, exactly what she expected to hear. "I suppose that makes sense," I said, and the relief that passed across her face was subtle, but unmistakable. She had already counted this as a victory, already begun to move pieces forward in a game she believed she was controlling, and I allowed that belief to settle, to grow, because sometimes the most powerful move is not to resist, but to let the other person think they have already won, while you are still learning exactly how they plan to lose. The drive home felt longer than it should have, even though the distance had not changed in over 20 years, and as I sat in the back seat of the car Daniel had arranged, I kept my gaze fixed on the passing streets, watching familiar houses blur into something distant and unrecognizable, as if the world I had known was quietly shifting without asking for my permission. No one spoke during the ride, not Daniel, not Olivia. And certainly not me, because silence had settled between us like an unspoken agreement, one that suggested everything important had already been decided elsewhere. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed the first change immediately, not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle, almost easy to miss if you were not paying attention. The porch light had been replaced, a different shade, a colder tone, and for a moment I stood there looking at it, realizing that something as small as a light could feel like a boundary, like a quiet declaration that this house was no longer entirely mine. Inside, the air smelled the same, a faint trace of the lavender cleaner I had used for years, but even that seemed to belong to a version of the house that was already fading, and as I stepped into the living room, I noticed the second change. The framed photograph that had always rested on the side table, the one from our 30th anniversary, was gone, replaced by a newer picture of Daniel and Olivia smiling on a beach somewhere I had never been invited to. I did not ask about it, I did not touch it, I simply let my eyes move past it as if it had always been that way. Because reacting would have been too easy, and I was no longer interested in easy responses. Daniel cleared his throat behind me, the sound hesitant, uncertain, as if he were trying to find the right words in a conversation that had already moved beyond him. "Mom, we should probably sit down and talk about a few things," he said, and I turned slowly, offering him a small, polite nod that encouraged him to continue without giving him anything more. We sat at the dining table. The same table where countless meals had been shared, where birthdays had been celebrated, where quiet evenings had unfolded over simple conversations, and yet now it felt different, not because the table had changed, but because the purpose behind this moment had shifted. Olivia remained standing for a second longer before taking her seat, positioning herself beside Daniel in a way that felt deliberate, aligned, and I could not help but notice how easily she had become the one guiding the rhythm of the room. "We have been thinking about what comes next," she began, her voice carrying that same measured calm, and there was something about the way she said it that made it clear this was not a discussion, but a presentation, something already outlined, already structured, already decided. "The house is large, and maintenance can be overwhelming, especially now," and Daniel nodded beside her, not adding anything, just reinforcing what had already been said, as if his role was no longer to speak, but to confirm. I listened carefully, not interrupting, not questioning, allowing each word to settle into place, because every detail mattered now, every assumption, every expectation they revealed without realizing it. "There are communities that offer more support," Olivia continued, "places where you can have your own space but also access to assistance if you need it, activities, social events, people in similar stages of life," and I almost smiled at the precision of it, the way it was framed as an opportunity rather than a removal, as if the language itself could soften what was actually being proposed. I folded my hands on the table, mirroring the same calm they were projecting, and tilted my head slightly as if considering the idea with genuine thought, even though inside, the pattern was becoming clearer with every second. This was not about concern, it was about transition, about repositioning me into a role that no longer interfered with their plans, and the realization did not come with anger, but with a quiet sense of clarity that felt almost steady. Daniel finally looked at me then, his eyes searching for something, perhaps agreement, perhaps reassurance. And I held his gaze just long enough to let him see exactly what I wanted him to see, a version of me that was calm, reasonable, and willing to cooperate. "I understand," I said softly, my voice even, controlled, and the shift in the room was immediate, a subtle release of tension, a confirmation that things were moving in the direction they expected. Olivia's shoulders relaxed just slightly, her expression smoothing into something almost satisfied, and in that moment, I saw it clearly. The assumption that I would step aside without resistance, that I would accept the path they had already mapped out for me, and I let that assumption settle, because sometimes the most effective way to understand someone's plan is to let them believe it is already working. I stood up slowly, excusing myself with a quiet politeness that felt almost automatic, and as I made my way toward the hallway, I allowed my hand to brush lightly against the wall, feeling the texture of a home I had built over decades. A home that now felt like a stage set for something I had not yet fully uncovered, and as I reached the doorway of my room, I paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because whatever they thought they were doing, whatever they believed they had already secured, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was only the beginning of a story they did not yet understand, and I had every intention of learning exactly how it would end before they even realized they had lost control. That night, I did not turn on the lights right away. I simply stood in the doorway of my bedroom and let the darkness settle around me, because there was something honest about it, something that did not pretend, something that did not rearrange itself to fit someone else's version of events. And as my eyes slowly adjusted, the familiar shapes began to emerge: the dresser against the wall, the armchair by the window, the bed that had held decades of quiet conversations and shared routines, and, for the first time since the morning began, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what had been taken, not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a quiet, steady way that moved through me like a realization rather than a reaction. I walked toward the nightstand and reached for the small drawer, the one I had opened countless times without thinking, and when I pulled it out, the soft sound of wood against wood felt louder than it should have, as if even the smallest action carried meaning now. Inside, everything was still in place: his watch, the one he wore every day for over 20 years, the folded note he had left on my birthday last spring, the reading glasses he insisted he did not need but always kept nearby, and I picked up the watch carefully, turning it over in my hands, feeling the familiar weight, the quiet tick that seemed to continue without hesitation. Without awareness of everything that had changed, I sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly beneath me, and closed my eyes for just a moment, not to escape, but to remember, because memory, unlike everything else, had not been altered yet. I saw him in the kitchen early in the morning, pouring coffee, the sunlight catching the edges of his hair as he read through the newspaper. I heard his voice in the living room discussing plans for the house. The way he would gesture toward different corners as if he could already see the future unfolding in every detail, and I remembered the conversations we had about what would happen after, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that suggested urgency, but in the calm, practical tone that had always defined him. He had been precise, careful with his words, not because he expected something to go wrong, but because he understood that clarity mattered, especially when it came to things that could be misunderstood later. My eyes opened slowly, and the room felt different again, not because anything had changed physically, but because the pieces were beginning to align in a way I could no longer ignore. I stood up and walked toward the closet, sliding the door open just enough to reveal the row of neatly arranged jackets, each one placed exactly where it had always been, and for a brief moment, I reached out to adjust one sleeve that had shifted slightly out of line, a small habit, an automatic gesture, but as I did, something else caught my attention. A small envelope tucked behind the fabric, partially hidden, as if it had been placed there intentionally, not meant to be found immediately, but not entirely concealed either. I paused, my hand hovering for a second before carefully pulling it free, the paper slightly worn at the edges, my name written across the front in his handwriting, clear, steady, unmistakable. I did not open it right away, I simply held it, feeling the weight of it. The quiet significance of something left behind not by accident, but with purpose, and as I turned it over, noticing the seal still intact, I felt that same clarity settle in again, stronger this time, more defined. Whatever had been set into motion today, whatever Olivia believed she was controlling, whatever Daniel thought he understood, it was all built on assumptions, on the idea that the past had already been accounted for, that everything that mattered had already been revealed. And standing there in the dim light of a room that still held every piece of the life I had built, I realized that they had overlooked something essential, something that had been quietly waiting beneath the surface, just like this envelope in my hands. I moved back to the bed and sat down once more, placing the envelope carefully on the blanket in front of me, my fingers resting lightly against it as if acknowledging its presence rather than rushing to uncover it. Because timing, I understood now more than ever, was everything, and whatever was inside, whatever truth it held, it would not be used in haste, it would not be revealed without purpose. I looked around the room one last time, taking in every detail, every memory, every quiet corner that had witnessed a life that could not simply be rewritten by a single day or a carefully arranged conversation, and as I reached for the envelope again, I allowed myself a small, controlled breath, not of hesitation, but of decision, because this was no longer about reacting to what had been done, it was about understanding what had been prepared long before any of this began, and more importantly, how it would be used to change everything they thought they had already secured. I did not open the envelope right away, not because I was afraid of what it might contain, but because I understood that once I did, there would be no returning to the version of events they believed I was still living in, and for a moment I simply sat there, the paper resting lightly in my hands, listening to the quiet ticking of the watch beside me as if time itself was waiting for me to decide when to move forward. The house had settled into silence, the kind that comes after a long day of carefully managed appearances, and somewhere down the hall I could hear faint movement, the low murmur of voices that stopped the moment the floor creaked beneath my step, and I realized then that even in my own home, conversations were being shaped around me, paused, adjusted, controlled, and the thought did not sting the way it might have before, it simply confirmed what I already knew. I ran my thumbs slowly along the edge of the envelope, feeling the slight roughness where it had been sealed. And then, with a steady breath, I opened it, careful, precise, as if the act itself required a certain respect for what had been left behind. Inside was a single folded sheet, his handwriting unmistakable, the same deliberate script I had seen in notes, in signatures, in the small reminders he used to leave on the kitchen counter, and as I unfolded it, I did not rush, I let each line reveal itself at its own pace, because meaning, I had learned, often lived between the words rather than within them. Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has not gone the way I hoped it would, the sentence began, simple, direct, and immediately I felt the room shift again, not physically, but in the way understanding settles into place without asking permission. He wrote about the house, about the decisions they had discussed, about the importance of clarity when it came to ownership, and as my eyes moved across the page, the careful structure of his thoughts became evident, each point laid out not with emotion, but with intention, as if he had anticipated not just the possibility of confusion, but the likelihood of it. There were references to documents, to meetings, to conversations that had taken place quietly over the past year, moments I had not questioned at the time because they had seemed routine, ordinary, part of the life we had built together, and yet now, seen through this lens, they carried a different weight entirely. He mentioned a meeting with Mr. Harris, the attorney who had handled our affairs for decades, noting that certain arrangements had been adjusted, not drastically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to ensure that the truth could not be easily altered by assumption or convenience. I paused there, my fingers tightening slightly around the paper, because that name alone shifted something important. It introduced a variable they had not accounted for, a piece of the structure that existed outside of their control. The letter continued, not with warnings, not with accusations, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the possibility that people might behave differently when circumstances changed, and as I read those lines, I realized that he had not been naive, he had not been blind to the dynamics unfolding around us. He had simply chosen to prepare rather than confront, to document rather than argue. At the bottom of the page, his signature rested exactly as it always had, steady, confident, and beneath it, a final sentence that did not feel like an ending, but like a beginning. Trust what you know, not what they show you. I folded the letter carefully, aligning the edges just as I had done with the program earlier that day, and placed it back into the envelope, not out of habit, but out of intention, because this was no longer just information, it was direction. I stood up slowly, crossing the room to the window, and pulled the curtain aside just enough to let the faint light from the street filter in, casting long shadows across the floor, and for the first time since the morning began, I allowed myself to look at the house not as something being taken from me, but as something that still held more than they understood. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed softly, a quiet signal that the day was ending for them, that their version of events had reached its conclusion. But for me, the realization was different. It was not an ending at all, it was the moment everything shifted from observation to action, from understanding to preparation, and as I let the curtain fall back into place, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever they believed they had secured, whatever future they had already begun to imagine, it had been built on an incomplete foundation, and I was the one holding the missing piece. The next morning began earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because sleep had become unnecessary once clarity settled in, and as the first light filtered through the curtains, I was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed with the envelope resting neatly on the nightstand beside me, no longer a mystery, but a quiet confirmation of everything I needed to know. The house was still. The kind of stillness that exists before routines begin, before voices fill the space, before intentions reveal themselves through small, seemingly insignificant actions, and I moved through it carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, noticing details that had always been there but had never demanded my attention in this way before. The kitchen looked the same at first glance, the same arrangement of dishes, the same polished countertop, but as I stepped closer, I saw the subtle differences. A new set of mugs placed at the front of the cabinet, my usual one moved slightly to the side, not removed, just repositioned, as if making space without drawing attention to the shift, and I reached for it anyway, pouring coffee with steady hands, letting the familiar rhythm of the process anchor me in something predictable. Footsteps approached behind me, soft but deliberate. And I did not need to turn to know who it was, because I had already begun to recognize the patterns, the timing, the way certain conversations were positioned to feel casual while carrying something more beneath the surface. "You are up early," Olivia said, her voice light, almost surprised, though there was a carefulness to it now, a subtle awareness that had not been there before, and I nodded slightly, taking a sip of coffee before responding. "I have always preferred mornings," I said, keeping my tone even. Unremarkable, exactly what she expected, because expectation, I was learning, was something that could be shaped just as easily as perception. She moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, opening cabinets, adjusting items, creating the appearance of routine while maintaining control over the space in a way that felt increasingly deliberate, and I watched without appearing to watch, noting how naturally she occupied a place that had once been entirely mine. Daniel joined us a few minutes later, his presence more uncertain, his movements slower, as if he were still adjusting to something he could not quite define, and when he greeted me, his voice carried a hesitation that had not been there before, a slight pause before the word "Mom," as if the role itself had shifted in ways he did not fully understand. We sat at the table together, the three of us, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional. Before Olivia filled it again, "We were thinking about calling Mr. Harris later this week," she said, her tone casual, almost conversational, and I felt a small, almost imperceptible shift inside me at the mention of his name, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed that the next move had already been planned on their side as well. I set my cup down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, and looked up at her with a calm that felt entirely natural now. "That might be a good idea," I replied, allowing just enough agreement to keep everything moving in the direction they expected, because resistance at this stage would have disrupted the pattern, and I was not ready to disrupt anything yet. Olivia smiled slightly, a brief expression of satisfaction that passed as quickly as it appeared, and Daniel nodded in quiet support, either of them questioning the ease with which I accepted the suggestion, either of them considering that acceptance itself might be part of something larger. The conversation moved on to smaller things, schedules, errands, details that filled the space without adding meaning, and I participated just enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy, answering when necessary, listening when appropriate, all the while allowing my thoughts to settle into a clearer structure, one that no longer reacted, but planned. When the moment felt right, I stood, excusing myself with the same quiet politeness I had used the night before, and returned to my room, closing the door gently behind me, not to shut them out, but to create the space I needed to move forward. I crossed to the dresser and opened the top drawer. reaching past the familiar items to the small leather folder I had not touched in months, and as I placed the envelope inside it, aligning it carefully with the other documents that had once felt routine, I understood that routine itself had become something entirely different. This was no longer about preserving what had been, it was about understanding what had been prepared, what had been set into place long before any of this unfolded, and more importantly, how it would be revealed. I sat down at the desk by the window. The same desk where I had once written holiday cards and grocery lists, and allowed myself a moment of stillness, not to hesitate, but to confirm the direction I was about to take, because every step from this point forward would matter, every word, every decision, every silence, and as I reached for the phone, dialing a number I had known by memory for years, I felt no urgency, no fear, only a steady, controlled sense of purpose, because whatever they believed they were arranging, whatever outcome they had already begun to anticipate, I was now moving within the same timeline, but with an understanding they did not yet possess, and that difference, I knew, would change everything. I held the phone to my ear for only a moment before the line connected, and when I heard his voice on the other end, calm and familiar, it felt like stepping back into a version of reality that had not been quietly rearranged without my knowledge. "Margaret," he said, and there was a pause just long enough to suggest recognition beyond formality. "I was wondering when you might call," and I allowed a small breath to leave my chest. Not of relief, but of confirmation, because that single sentence told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in a situation that had been carefully constructed around me. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," I replied, my voice steady, measured, exactly as it needed to be. "I believe we should meet. There are a few things I would like to review," and I chose my words deliberately, not revealing more than necessary, because information, like timing, had become something to control rather than share. "Of course," he said without hesitation, "I can make time for you this afternoon," and the ease with which he responded removed any remaining doubt, because nothing about this felt unexpected to him, nothing about my call required explanation, and that alone shifted the balance in a way Olivia and Daniel could not yet see. I ended the call quietly and set the phone down on the desk, letting my fingers rest against its surface for a moment longer than necessary, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness that every step forward now carried weight, intention, consequence. The house remained quiet beyond my door, the distant sound of movement suggesting that routines were continuing as planned, conversations unfolding without interruption, and I stood, smoothing the front of my blouse before stepping back into the hallway, my expression composed, my posture unchanged. Because whatever I was about to do would not begin with confrontation, it would begin with observation continuing exactly as they expected. Olivia was in the living room when I passed, seated comfortably with a tablet in her hands, her attention focused, her presence relaxed in a way that suggested confidence, and when she glanced up at me, her smile was immediate, polite, carefully measured. "Are you heading out?" she asked, her tone light, and I nodded. "Just a few errands," I said, keeping my voice neutral, offering nothing more than what was required because the less she questioned, the more she believed. Daniel appeared a moment later, his expression still carrying that quiet hesitation, as if he sensed something shifting but could not yet define it. "Do you need anything, Mom?" he asked, and I met his gaze briefly, long enough to acknowledge the question, not long enough to invite anything deeper. "No, I will be fine," I replied, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to settle whatever uncertainty remained, allowing him to step back into the role he had already chosen. I left the house without looking back, not because it did not matter, but because I understood that looking back too soon can disrupt the forward motion of a plan, and as I stepped into the car and closed the door behind me, I allowed myself a single moment of stillness before turning the key. The engine starting with a quiet hum that felt almost symbolic, as if something long dormant had just been set into motion. The drive to Mr. Harris's office took just under 20 minutes, a route I had traveled many times before, though never with this particular sense of clarity, and as I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed how unchanged everything appeared from the outside, the same brick exterior, the same neatly trimmed hedges, the same sign bearing his name in understated lettering, all of it steady, reliable, untouched by the subtle shifts that had taken place elsewhere. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a warmth that felt genuine, not practiced. "Mrs. Whitmore, it is good to see you again," and I returned the greeting with a polite nod, allowing myself to be led down the familiar hallway toward his office, where the door was already open. As if he had been expecting me not just today, but for some time, he stood as I entered, offering a handshake that carried both professionalism and something quieter beneath it, something closer to understanding. And as I took my seat across from him, placing my bag carefully on the chair beside me, I did not rush into words. I allowed the silence to settle first. Because silence, I had learned, often invites the truth to surface on its own. He watched me for a moment, his expression thoughtful, measured. "Before speaking, I assume you have read the letter," he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and I nodded once, slowly. "Yes, I have," I replied, my voice calm, steady, exactly as it had been all morning, and for the first time since the day began, I saw something shift in his expression, not surprise, not concern, but recognition. As if the final piece of a much larger arrangement had just fallen into place, and in that moment, I understood that whatever came next would not be improvised, it would be revealed. Mr. Harris did not reach for any documents immediately. He simply leaned back slightly in his chair and studied me with a kind of quiet patience that suggested he had been waiting not just for this meeting, but for this exact moment, the moment when I would arrive not with questions, but with understanding. "You have already noticed the inconsistencies," he said calmly, his voice even, measured, as if he were continuing a conversation that had begun long before today, and I nodded once, not offering details, because details would come in their own time, and he seemed to respect that, turning slightly toward the desk as he opened a folder that had been placed within easy reach, not hidden, not emphasized, simply present. "Your husband was very thorough," he continued, sliding a set of documents toward me with deliberate care, and as I looked down at the neatly arranged pages, I recognized the structure immediately. Not because I had seen these exact documents before, but because I had lived alongside the man who created them, and I understood the way he thought, the way he prepared, the way he anticipated outcomes that others might dismiss. "The primary estate plan remains exactly as it was publicly presented," Mr. Harris explained, his tone steady, "but there are additional provisions that were designed to activate under specific conditions," and as he spoke, I felt that same clarity settle in again, stronger now, more defined, because this was not speculation, this was confirmation. I moved my hand slowly across the first page, tracing the lines without reading them fully yet allowing the weight of what they represented to settle before diving into the specifics, because once I did, there would be no ambiguity left. "These provisions were not created out of distrust," Mr. Harris continued, as if anticipating the direction of my thoughts, "but out of caution. Your husband believed in clarity, especially when it came to matters that could be influenced by external pressure, and the phrasing was precise. Careful, not accusatory, but protective, as if the intent was not to confront wrongdoing, but to prevent it from succeeding." I lifted my eyes briefly, meeting his gaze, and there was no need for further explanation, because we both understood the implication without stating it directly. He had seen something, or perhaps simply understood human nature well enough to prepare for it, and instead of reacting, he had structured a response that would only reveal itself when necessary. I turned the page then, reading more carefully now, absorbing each clause, each condition. And with every line, the picture became clearer: the house, the accounts, the authority to make decisions, all of it had layers, visible on the surface in one form, and secured beneath it in another, contingent upon actions that had already begun to unfold. There was a specific section that drew my attention, not because it was longer, but because it was simpler, direct in a way that left no room for interpretation. And as I read it, I felt a quiet shift in my posture, not outwardly visible, but unmistakable within me. "This changes things," I said finally, my voice calm, not surprised, not emotional, simply acknowledging what was now undeniable, and Mr. Harris nodded once, as if he had expected that exact response. "It clarifies things," he replied, and the distinction between those two words did not go unnoticed. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing myself a moment to consider not just what the documents said, but what they meant in the context of everything that had happened over the past 24 hours, the funeral, the conversations, the assumptions that had been made in my absence. All of it now reframed through a lens that revealed not just intention, but miscalculation. They had acted too soon, I said quietly, not as a statement of accusation, but as an observation, and Mr. Harris's expression remained neutral, though there was a subtle acknowledgement in his eyes. Timing matters, he said simply, and that was all that needed to be said. I gathered the documents carefully, aligning them with the same precision I had used all day, and placed them back into the folder, not out of habit, but out of purpose, because these were no longer just papers, they were structure, leverage, truth. What would you like to do next? He asked, his tone open, not directive, and I paused for just a moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I was choosing the exact moment when preparation would become action. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it, my expression composed, my voice steady. I would like to invite them to a conversation, I said, not raising my tone, not adding emphasis, just stating what would come next as if it were the most natural progression in the world. And as I stood to leave, I felt no urgency, no need to rush what had already been set into motion, because for the first time since the day began, I was no longer responding to what they believed they controlled. I was stepping into a position they had not prepared for, one where every move would be deliberate, visible, and impossible to undo. When I returned home that afternoon, the house felt different again, but this time not because something had been taken from me, but because I was no longer seeing it through the same lens, and as I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, I noticed the quiet immediately, not the heavy silence from before, but something lighter, almost expectant, as if the space itself was aware that something had shifted. Olivia was seated in the living room exactly where I had seen her earlier, her posture relaxed, her attention fixed on her screen, and when she looked up, her expression carried that same composed confidence, though there was something else now, something subtle, a trace of curiosity that had not been there before. Perhaps because she sensed a change she could not yet define. Daniel stood near the window, his hands in his pockets, his stance uncertain, and when he turned toward me, his eyes searched my face for something familiar, something reassuring, but I offered him only the same calm composure I had maintained all day, because reassurance was no longer something I was willing to give without purpose. I placed my bag on the table with quiet precision and looked at both of them, not with confrontation, not with accusation, but with a steadiness that shifted the room in a way either of them expected. I spoke with Mr. Harris today, I said, my voice even, controlled, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable, a slight tightening in Olivia's posture, a pause in Daniel's breathing, the kind of reaction that reveals more than words ever could. Olivia smiled then, a careful, measured expression that suggested she was already preparing a response. That is good, she said lightly. We were just discussing reaching out to him ourselves, and I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without engaging with it, because engagement would have allowed her to guide the direction, and that was no longer something I intended to allow. I took a seat at the table, folding my hands neatly in front of me, and for a moment, I let the silence settle again, not as hesitation, but as control, because silence, when used correctly, can draw attention more effectively than any raised voice. There are a few things we need to clarify, I continued, not raising my tone, not emphasizing any particular word, simply allowing the statement to exist on its own. And this time, either of them interrupted, either of them attempted to redirect the conversation, because something in my voice had shifted in a way that made it clear this was no longer a discussion they could manage. I reached into my bag and removed the folder, placing it gently on the table between us, not sliding it forward, not presenting it aggressively, just setting it there as a quiet fact, and I watched as Olivia's eyes moved toward it, just for a second, before returning to my face, her expression still composed, but no longer entirely certain. Daniel glanced between us, his confusion more visible now, as if he were beginning to realize that the structure he had accepted so easily was not as stable as he had believed. Your father made very specific arrangements, I said, my voice steady, each word placed carefully, not as a challenge, but as a clarification, and I saw the moment it landed, not fully understood yet, but enough to disrupt the certainty they had been holding on to. Olivia shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers tightening just enough to betray the smallest hint of tension. Though her voice remained controlled when she responded, "We are aware of the arrangements, Margaret," she said, and I allowed a small pause before answering, not to create drama, but to allow the weight of the next sentence to settle fully. "I do not think you are," I replied, and there was no anger in my tone, no accusation, just a quiet certainty that could not be easily dismissed. I opened the folder then, not quickly, not with emphasis, but with the same deliberate care I had used all day, and, as I turned it toward them, I did not need to explain what was written inside, because explanation was no longer necessary. The truth had already been structured, documented, and prepared long before this moment. The room remained still, the air almost suspended, and I allowed that stillness to remain, because this was not about forcing understanding, it was about allowing it to arrive on its own, without interference. Without manipulation, I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and for the first time since everything began, I felt no need to observe, no need to analyze, because the outcome was no longer uncertain. It had already been determined long before any of us sat at this table. They had believed they were guiding the story, shaping the outcome, securing their place within it. But as I watched the shift unfold in front of me, subtle yet undeniable, I understood something with complete clarity. I had not needed to fight them. I had only needed to wait long enough for the truth to reveal itself, and in doing so, I had not just protected what was mine. I had allowed them to show exactly who they were without ever asking them to explain.